Good evening. Thanks so much for being with us here on Newsfeed this afternoon. You and I live in the country with the highest inequality in the world. We've known for generations that improving education, improving the empowerment of our children is the best way to solve that. And yet, during the pandemic and the lockdown, our children have lost so much time at school. They may, in fact, never catch up. There's been a big conference around education and social justice. One of the people speaking, one of the people arranging it, is Professor Thuli Madonsela. She is the Law Trust Chair in Social Justice at the University of Stellenbosch, of course, also a former public protector. Professor Madonsela, good afternoon to you, and thank you for your time this Friday afternoon. I mean, in a way, it seems so obvious. Education is absolutely vital to try and achieve social justice, and yet sometimes I think we almost seem to forget that.
Good afternoon, Stephen. Yes, education is essential for social justice because it does level the playing field in all other areas of life. But it's also important that you level the playing field inside education so that it does not worsen inequality in the rest of life. And you're asking, why do we not realize the obvious? I think normally people do realize that education does play a role in advancing social justice. It's just a question of policy short-sightedness regarding what needs to be done.
There's policy short-sightedness. Is it also because education leads, so good, a quality education puts someone often perhaps in the middle class or above that. They then use their education to get a good education for their children, which is a better education than the children other people are able to do. And it's actually very difficult to say to someone, no, you can't send your child to a better quality school than someone else.
Absolutely. It is in that way that education can exacerbate existing inequality. Although if you look at people like myself, you'll find that education has been an equalizer. We cannot stop private schools from excluding others, but we can regulate the amount of money that private schools are charging. And I think that was the point that was raised by Neva Makhetla about making sure that the pricing of private schools is not far outside the means of ordinary people. Private schools can also be an important role player in fixing public schools. I mean, if you look at what Mrs. Louise van Rijn is doing in Partners for Possibility, some of the executives that are helping to fix ailing government schools are executives that have run successful private schools.
It's a question that we ask ourselves in South Africa all the time, but I think you will find it's a question that people living in New York or London, Beijing will ask themselves too. Why are our government schools, which are going to educate the majority of our children, not producing a proper quality education? And it's a very difficult question with a lot of different elements to it.
It certainly is, but it's not natural that public schools should be worse than private schools. In the UK, public schools are really, really doing well. In Singapore, public schools were doing terribly, but as part of their revamping of everything in the public sector to become a world-class country, they fixed their private schools. In South Africa, one of the things discussed at the conference yesterday was the fact that our terrible private schools, or our terrible public schools, are in that condition partly because of mistakes in the last 27 years of democracy, but a lot because of what was done to them during apartheid. And Professor Ramos, who spoke about the situation in the US, said also even in the US, the same thing. Schools in black neighborhoods, Latino neighborhoods, etc., are in that state of disarray, partly because of being neglected now, but a lot of it has to do with the legacy of unjust history.
I mean, you see that in, for example, I think in Limpopo and particularly the Eastern Cape as well. These are schools that don't have proper sanitation I'm almost certain if these schools had more white learners, there would suddenly somehow be proper sanitation. I mean, it sounds like a silly thing to say, but that's how our society still is.
It certainly is, and part of it is the legacy of the past. When I was working at Grootes as a researcher, we did research that was showing that for every 4 rand at that time that was spent on a white child, only 1 was spent on a black child, and before then it was even worse. However, what you're showing is also distribution of resources among private individuals, because that poor school would be in a black neighborhood. And that's where we say poverty operates like an epidemic. Because let's say government was failing. If parents were intellectually empowered and resource empowered, what stops them from using building funds, school building funds, to build a better school? And I think one of the calls from Professor Reimers at the conference yesterday was, let's stop waiting for government to fix things. We're going to wait for a long time. 2 things should happen is that civil society should stand up and question government, call government to order where government is doing wrong. But the rest of us who have intellectual and other forms of capital, let's throw it in there. Let's create an education renaissance. And he said, if we don't do this, we're going to find ourselves in a situation like Germany. He said that what precipitated Hitler and Nazism was neglecting poverty. Italy, on the other hand, after a calamity, instead of waiting for everything to be done by government, intellectuals came together and suggested to government that money be spent around education, around the arts, and what emerged is what we now call the Renaissance, the very first world Renaissance that produced amazing works of art, but also led to Italy's prosperity. And Prof. Reimers says both South Africa and the US are in a possibility of using the COVID-19 calamity as a springboard for an educational renaissance.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because obviously we've seen our education and everywhere around the world become a lot more unequal during the pandemic. I mean, we still have most children in this country who are at government schools going to school only every second day or every second week, and most children from richer backgrounds going to face-to-face teaching full-time every day. This is going to have a very long-term impact, and many children perhaps won't finish school as a result, or many more than would not have otherwise. You talk about a springboard for a more equal education system. What could happen? I mean, we've got to look at the possibility. We've got to look at what would give us hope for the future. How could a new education system work?
Well, a new education system would be founded on better policies, more aligned to the challenges of our time in terms of, in terms of the demands of the 4th Industrial Revolution, but also the mindset, giving our children skills to think. A lot of our education content gives our children skills to memorize. Machines are coming, and memory is not going to help because machines are going to do better. But that education also teach our children how to be human, how to embrace each other's humanity, how not to think that you're better or worse than another person. And one of the scholars in the room was saying that's possible provided we don't leave everything to government. We bring in our own resources when we have them, we bring our own ideas, and we roll up our sleeves and go into the schools if we can.
And Professor Madonsela, I mean, I think many people see you as a moral voice in our society. I'm sure you've been watching what's been happening with the Health Minister, Dr. William Mkhize. We're in the middle of a pandemic, a very difficult situation. We have the digital vibes scandal. Do you have a view on what should happen here? I mean, should he, the English would call it, should he consider his position? Should he consider resigning? Do you have a view on this?
Well, I don't want to prejudge the minister. It does look bad. I think the optics do look bad, but we should not prejudge him. It might help him and his department if he put a distance between himself and the department, it might not be resigning. It could be to take long leave until this matter has been sorted out.
Professor Thuli Madonsela, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. I really do appreciate your time. Professor of Law and Social Justice at Wits University, and of course a former public protector as well. Professor Madonsela, thank you. Well, more